Some stories aren't just told, they are felt. Welcome to Phoenix Soul Stories. You brought her here because you thought I would care. The words existed only in David Mercer's imagination, because Vicky Winslow had not said them. She had not needed to. David stood beneath the warm chandelier light of a waterfront ballroom in Newport, Rhode Island, with Susan Barrett's hand resting elegantly around his arm and the Atlantic darkening beyond the tall windows, and for the first time that evening, he wondered whether coming had been a mistake. 10 minutes earlier, he had felt certain of himself. He had arrived in a charcoal suit tailored close to his frame, his fiancée beside him in a pale champagne dress, her engagement ring catching every stray thread of light. Old friends had noticed them immediately. Congratulations had followed. So had approving smiles, curious glances, and the familiar questions about wedding dates and honeymoon plans. David answered easily. He had always been good in rooms like this. He knew when to smile, when to shake a hand, when to make success appear effortless. Somewhere beneath that confidence, however, lived a smaller intention he had never admitted aloud. He knew Vicky would be here. The bride had remained friends with both of them after the divorce, and when David accepted the invitation, he had pictured the moment his former wife would see him again. He imagined surprise first. Perhaps discomfort. Perhaps the brief tightening around her eyes when she noticed Susan and understood exactly what the diamond on her hand meant. David told himself he did not want to hurt Vicky. He simply wanted her to see that his life had continued beautifully without her. Then he saw Vicky across the room, and the little scene he had rehearsed collapsed without making a sound. She stood near a 12-foot window overlooking the harbor, speaking with an older couple David vaguely recognized from Boston. Her midnight blue dress was simple, almost severe compared with the glitter around her, and her light brown hair rested loosely at her shoulders. There was no dramatic entrance, no attempt to command the room, yet people seemed to turn toward her. Naturally, Vicky listened when the older woman spoke, touched her arm gently when she laughed, then stepped aside so a server carrying champagne could pass. She looked different, David decided, although he could not immediately identify why. It was not the dress. It was not her hair. It was something quieter. During their marriage, Vicky had often entered crowded rooms by searching for him first, as though David were the fixed point from which she measured where she belonged. Tonight she searched for no one. Susan followed his gaze. "Someone you know?" she asked. David lifted his glass before answering. "My ex-wife." Susan looked across the ballroom with open curiosity rather than jealousy. "Vicky." David nodded. He had mentioned the name before, but only in fragments, the way people describe a house they once lived in. Susan studied her for another second. "She's beautiful." David gave a small shrug that arrived half a beat too late. She always knew how to dress for these things. It was an unnecessary comment, and he knew it the moment he heard himself say it. Then Vicky turned. Her eyes found him almost immediately. David straightened without meaning to. For one suspended second, the quartet near the dance floor seemed farther away, softened beneath the clink of silverware and low conversation. Susan's fingers remained around his arm. David waited. He waited for Vicky's expression to change when she noticed the woman beside him. He waited for her gaze to drop toward Susan's ring. It did, briefly, but there was no hesitation afterward. No wounded surprise. No old question hiding behind her eyes. Vicky simply excused herself from the couple beside her and crossed the room. Her steps were unhurried. David remembered another Vicky suddenly, standing barefoot in their kitchen years ago, asking whether he would be home for dinner. He pushed the memory away before it could settle. She stopped a comfortable distance from them. Up close, the difference was even harder to name. Vicky did not look richer or younger or transformed into someone designed to make him regret leaving. She looked settled. That disturbed him more. "Hello, David," she said. Her voice was warm, composed, almost casual. "Vicky." He smiled. "It's been a while." "It has." David turned slightly toward Susan, preparing the introduction he had imagined more than once. "This is Susan Barrett, my fiancée." Vicky looked at Susan, and David watched carefully. "It's lovely to meet you, Susan. Congratulations." She meant it. That was the problem. Susan smiled back. "Thank you. I've heard about you." A faint amusement touched Vicky's eyes, But she rescued David from the awkwardness instead of using it. Only the flattering stories, I hope. Susan laughed. David did not. He was still waiting for something Vicky seemed unwilling to give him. Regret. Curiosity. Comparison. Anything that would prove his arrival had landed with the force he expected. Instead, someone called Vicky's name from across the room. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at them. I should go say hello. Enjoy the wedding. She touched Susan lightly on the arm. And congratulations again. Then she walked away. David watched her disappear into the crowd. She never looked back. Beside him, Susan took a sip of champagne. She seems nice. David stared toward the place where Vicky had vanished between the guests. For reasons he could not explain, the compliment irritated him. He had come to the wedding expecting Vicky to see what she had lost. Instead, less than 5 minutes after arriving, David Mercer found himself wondering what had happened in the years he had not been looking. The quartet shifted into an old piano arrangement, and the first few notes reached David before he could stop them from opening a door he had kept closed for years. Suddenly Newport disappeared, replaced by a narrow kitchen outside Boston where Vicky once sat beneath a yellow pendant light with architectural drawings spread between 2 untouched dinner plates. Back then, Mercer Development had been little more than David, a rented office, 3 employees, and enough debt to make sleep feel irresponsible. Vicky had believed in him before belief became fashionable. She proofread proposals after midnight, drove across town to deliver forgotten documents, and learned the names of clients David was too exhausted to remember. Her own portfolio stayed inside a gray box beneath their desk. She had studied architecture because she wanted to design libraries, community centers, and public spaces where ordinary people could feel that someone had considered them. There was always another reason to wait. David needed help with a presentation. A client dinner appeared unexpectedly. Money was tight. Then money was no longer tight, but time somehow became tighter. Vicky kept saying she would return to her work when things settled down. Things never did. David remembered the first office with leaking windows and the night their largest early contract came through. He had lifted Vicky from her chair and told her they had finally made it. Years later, Mercer Development occupied several floors of a glass building, and Vicky spent more evenings eating alone. Success changed the rooms around them before either admitted it had changed their marriage. David traveled more. Vicky asked fewer questions. Their conversations became schedules, reservations, obligations, and polite updates spoken while one of them looked at a telephone. Nothing dramatic ended them. That was what made the ending so difficult to explain. There had been no single morning when love disappeared. It simply became something they remembered having. On the afternoon David finally said they should separate, Vicky stood beside the dining room table with both hands resting against the polished wood. He had prepared explanations during the drive home, but most sounded cruel once spoken aloud. He told her they wanted different lives. He told her neither of them was happy. Then he said the sentence that remained sharper in his memory than everything surrounding it. Maybe we simply outgrew each other. Vicky looked at him for several seconds. She did not cry. She did not argue. Her gaze moved toward the windows of the house they had chosen together, then back to him. Maybe, she said. David had mistaken her quietness for agreement. 3 weeks later, she left with 2 suitcases and the gray portfolio box that had remained unopened for years. David remembered watching from the front steps as she placed it carefully in the back seat of her car. He almost asked what was inside, then realized he already knew. Her drawings. Her unfinished plans. The part of her life that had spent years waiting beneath his. He told himself divorce would free them both. In the months afterward, his company expanded, invitations multiplied, and people stopped asking about Vicky. Eventually, David stopped asking himself about her too. He assumed she had found something comfortable, something smaller, something suited to the woman he remembered. Standing in the Newport ballroom years later, he understood how little evidence he had ever possessed for that assumption. David. Susan's voice brought the chandeliers back into focus. She was watching him with mild concern. You disappeared for a second. He smiled automatically. Just remembered something. Across the room, Vicky was laughing with a woman near the windows, one hand wrapped loosely around a glass of sparkling water. She looked nothing like someone carrying the remains of an abandoned life. David lowered his eyes and another memory surfaced. The gray portfolio box disappearing into Vicky's car. For the first time, he wondered what she had done after driving away. David tried to return his attention to Susan, but the ballroom had begun offering him small details he could no longer ignore. Vicky was not standing at the edge of the evening waiting to be noticed. People were finding her. A silver-haired man David recognized from a Boston real estate conference crossed half the room to shake her hand. Minutes later, a woman known for funding arts programs in New England greeted Vicky with an embrace and introduced her to two other guests. Vicky accepted each conversation without performance. She listened more than she spoke, smiled when something genuinely amused her, and moved through the reception with the ease of someone who had stopped wondering whether she belonged there. David watched from beside a tall cocktail table. "You are doing it again," Susan said. "Doing what?" Looking at her. Her tone was light, but her eyes were not. David reached for his water. "I am looking around the room." Susan followed his gaze toward Vicky. "Of course." Before David could answer, a server approached Vicky with a small envelope that had apparently been left at the reception desk. "Mrs. Rowe?" he asked. Vicky turned. "Yes, thank you." David's hand stopped halfway to his glass. The server walked away. Vicky opened the envelope, read the card inside, and smiled before slipping it into her purse. David stared at her profile. "Mrs. Rowe." He repeated the name silently, searching his memory. There had been no Rowe in their old circle, no Rowe among Vicky's relatives, no reason anyone would address her that way unless something had changed. Did he just call her Mrs. Rowe? David asked. Susan looked at him. "I think so. Maybe he has the wrong person." Susan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He handed her an envelope with her name on it. David said nothing. Across the room, Vicky lifted her left hand to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, and the chandelier light caught something David had missed before. A wedding band. It was narrow, understated, and unmistakable. No oversized stone. No attempt to advertise itself. Just a simple band resting where another ring had once rested years ago. David felt a strange pause inside himself. He had always known Vicky might remarry. Of course she would. Their divorce had been final for years. He had built an entirely separate life, and Susan was standing beside him wearing the ring he had chosen for their future. Yet knowing something was possible was different from seeing proof of it beneath ballroom lights. "You did not know," Susan said quietly. David looked at her. "Know what?" "That she was married. We do not keep in touch." "That was not what I asked." David adjusted his cuff, buying himself a second. "No. I did not know." Susan studied Vicky again. "Interesting. What is?" "Nothing." She took a small sip of champagne. David disliked the answer because it sounded exactly like an answer. He glanced toward Vicky once more. She was speaking with the bride's father now, laughing softly at something he had said. David searched for signs of the man who belonged to the ring. No one stood beside her. No husband hovered nearby. No obvious partner appeared when she moved. Between tables, the empty space beside her became more noticeable precisely because David was looking for someone to fill it. "She came alone," he said. Susan turned toward him. "Did she?" David frowned. "I have not seen anyone with her." Susan's eyes settled on him for a moment before returning to Vicky. "Maybe her husband is coming later." David almost asked why she thought that, but a coordinator stepped into the center of the ballroom and announced that guests should begin taking their seats for the ceremony. Conversations softened. Chairs shifted. Vicky moved toward the front rows. As she reached her place, David noticed the chair immediately beside hers. Empty. A folded place card rested against the linen program. He was too far away to read the name. Vicky touched the back of that chair once before sitting down. An unconscious gesture so familiar and affectionate that David suddenly stopped wondering whether the wedding band meant what he thought it meant. Susan slipped her arm through his. "We should sit." David followed her toward their row, but his eyes returned once more to that empty chair. For years, he had imagined Vicky's life after him as a quiet continuation of the woman he had left behind. Now there was another last name, another ring, and an unseen man whose absence seemed to occupy more space than David's presence ever could. He sat beside his fiancée as the room settled into silence, and for the first time that evening, the question was no longer whether Vicky had moved on. It was who she had moved on with. While the ceremony began beneath soft white flowers and candlelight, Vicky kept her attention on the couple at the front of the ballroom, but the empty chair beside her carried her thoughts backward to a time when emptiness had looked very different. After the divorce, there had been no elegant apartment waiting for her, no dramatic reinvention, and certainly no wealthy man arriving to repair what David had left behind. There had been a third-floor rental outside Boston with narrow windows, uneven hardwood floors, and a radiator that clicked through cold mornings. Vicky had bought a second-hand table for $40 and placed it beside the kitchen window because the apartment had no room for a proper desk. Every morning, she woke at 5:40, made coffee in a chipped white mug, and opened the gray portfolio box she had carried from the marriage. For several days she only looked. Old library concepts, community centers, public courtyards, drawings made by a younger woman who had once believed there would always be time later. Then one morning Vicky sharpened a pencil and began again. Her first applications brought polite rejection letters. Her first freelance project paid barely enough to cover groceries and utilities. She redesigned the waiting area of a neighborhood nonprofit, then helped a small library reorganize a neglected reading room. She measured walls herself, carried sample books in the trunk of her aging sedan, and learned which coffee shop opened early enough for meetings before sunrise. There were months when every dollar had a destination before it reached her account. Yet something inside those difficult mornings felt unexpectedly clean. When a client rejected her idea, the disappointment belonged to her. When someone approved a design, the satisfaction belonged to her too. There was no company dinner she had to attend because David needed the right impression. No evening arranged around someone else's ambition. No unfinished sentence abandoned because his telephone rang. Her life was smaller than the one she had left, but every inch of it was hers. One Saturday, Vicky spent 6 hours repainting the walls of a children's reading room after a contractor canceled. Near closing time, she stepped back with blue paint on her sleeve and watched a little girl choose a book from the new low shelves Vicky had insisted upon. The child sat beneath a window where afternoon sunlight reached the cushions exactly as Vicky had planned. Vicky stood there holding a paint roller and smiled. Nobody applauded. Nobody knew what the moment meant. That was precisely why she remembered it. Her work slowly began traveling farther than she did. A nonprofit director recommended her to another organization. A library board called. Then a community foundation asked her to submit a proposal for a larger project. Vicky stopped introducing herself as someone returning to architecture and simply began saying, "I am a designer." Years passed through ordinary victories. Better contracts. A brighter apartment. Her first employee. Her first project completed under her own name. The woman who once waited for David to come home began forgetting to check the time because she was absorbed in work she loved. Back in Newport, applause rose around Vicky as the newly married couple exchanged smiles. She joined everyone on her feet, her expression softening as the bride laughed through happy tears. David stood several rows behind her. He could not see the mornings at the second-hand table or the rejection letters stacked beside cold coffee. He could not know about the reading room, the first contract, or the quiet afternoon when Vicky realized an entire day had passed without her thinking about him once. All he could see was the woman standing beneath the chandelier light now. When Vicky sat again, her fingers brushed the empty chair beside her. She glanced at the place card and smiled to herself. Years earlier, she had learned that rebuilding a life did not begin when someone new arrived. It began on the morning she understood that being alone and being abandoned were not the same thing. By the time another man eventually entered her life, Vicky had already found the person she had spent too many years postponing. Vicky met Bennett Rowe on a rainy Tuesday morning in Cambridge, 3 years after she had carried that gray portfolio box out of her marriage. By then, her small design practice had earned enough trust to compete for a community library renovation funded by a private foundation. She arrived 20 minutes early with rolled plans beneath one arm and rainwater darkening the shoulders of her coat. A man in a navy jacket was already sitting at the conference table, drinking coffee from a paper cup and reading her proposal. Vicky assumed he worked for the foundation. "You are early," he said. "So are you." He smiled and stood. Bennett Rowe. His handshake was warm, his manner unhurried. Nothing about him announced importance. During the meeting, Bennett asked precise questions and listened to every answer. When another representative suggested removing the children's courtyard to create more rentable event space, Vicky opened her plans and pointed to the eastern side of the building. "That courtyard is the reason this design works," she said. The room became quiet. She explained how morning sunlight would reach the reading area, how parents could see the courtyard from inside, and why removing it might improve revenue but weaken the purpose of the building. Years earlier, Vicky might have softened the argument until everyone else felt comfortable. She did not do that anymore. "I cannot recommend a design I do not believe serves the people who will use it," she finished. Bennett leaned back, studying the drawings. Vicky expected resistance. Instead, he pushed the plans toward her. "Then show me the better version." She did. 2 weeks later, the courtyard remained. Bennett appeared throughout the project, sometimes in meetings, sometimes walking the site with the construction team. He remembered the custodian's name. He carried his own coffee. Once, when lunch arrived late, Vicky found him sitting on an unfinished windowsill eating a turkey sandwich beside an electrician and discussing baseball. She learned about him slowly because Bennett rarely volunteered information about himself. He knew architecture. He asked about materials. He understood financing far better than anyone Vicky had met. But when she asked where he had learned so much, he only said, "I have been around a few projects." Their friendship developed in ordinary moments. Coffee after meetings. Arguments about lighting. A Saturday morning spent reviewing accessibility changes while rain tapped against temporary plywood. Bennett never treated disagreement as disloyalty. When Vicky challenged him, he became curious instead of defensive. The difference unsettled her at first. She had spent years believing love required accommodation, that keeping peace meant becoming easier to live around. Bennett never asked her to become smaller so he could feel larger. Months later, after the library opened, Vicky stood inside the children's courtyard watching families move through the space she had fought to preserve. Bennett joined her carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You were right," he said. Vicky accepted one. "About what?" "The courtyard." She smiled. "I know." Bennett laughed, and something between them changed without either naming it. Their first dinner happened weeks later at a neighborhood restaurant with wooden booths and handwritten specials. No private room. No grand gesture. Bennett asked about the buildings Vicky still wanted to create. He did not ask why her marriage had failed until she chose to tell him. When she finally did, he listened without trying to rescue her from the story. Vicky learned the full scale of Bennett's world gradually. Roe Meridian Group managed investments across infrastructure, real estate, transportation, and technology. His name appeared on financial pages she rarely read. The man who had eaten a sandwich on an unfinished windowsill was worth more money than Vicky could comfortably imagine. Yet the revelation changed surprisingly little. By then, she already knew which Bennett mattered. The one who remembered how she took her coffee. The one who asked for her opinion and waited for the answer. The one who never confused providing opportunity with owning the person who accepted it. When Bennett eventually asked Vicky to marry him, there was no audience. They were standing in the completed library courtyard near sunset, children's books visible through the windows behind them. Vicky looked at him, then at the space that had begun with her refusal to surrender something she believed mattered. She understood the quiet symmetry immediately. David had once loved the version of Vicky who made room for his ambition. Bennett loved the woman who had learned to protect her own. She said yes because she no longer needed anyone to complete her life. She simply wanted this man to share it. By the time the applause faded in the Newport ballroom, David had stopped pretending the empty chair beside Vicky meant nothing. Guests rose and drifted toward the reception area, conversations returning beneath the soft music, and David waited until Susan became occupied with a friend from New York before approaching. A man he knew from several development conferences. Thomas Bellamy had spent 20 years moving comfortably between Boston finance and New England philanthropy, which made him exactly the kind of person who seemed to know everyone before everyone knew him. David kept his voice casual. "Thomas, do you know Vicky Winslow?" Thomas glanced across the room. "Vicky Rowe? Of course. The corrected name landed more heavily than David expected. Right. Roe. He slipped one hand into his pocket. I heard she got married. Thomas looked at him with open surprise. You seriously do not know? David felt irritation rise beneath his practiced smile. We have been divorced for years. We do not exactly exchange holiday cards. Thomas seemed ready to answer, but the wedding coordinator called guests toward their assigned tables, and someone beside him asked about seating. The moment disappeared. We will catch up later, Thomas said before moving away. David remained still for half a second. Vicky Rowe. He took out his telephone and typed the name, but before he could search, the coordinator politely reminded everyone that the couple had requested telephones remain put away through the formal reception entrance and first toast. David locked the screen. It should not have mattered. Instead, being denied the answer made him want it more. At their table, Susan unfolded her napkin and watched him place the telephone face down. Did you find out? She asked. David looked at her. Find out what? Who Vicky married? His silence answered for him. Susan gave a small nod and turned toward the center of the room. You are surprisingly curious for someone who does not care. David leaned back. I am curious because everyone here seems to know something I do not. That happens sometimes. There was no accusation in her voice, which made the words harder to dismiss. Across the ballroom, Vicky sat with the bride's family and several guests David recognized from charitable boards and investment circles. The empty chair remained beside her. Every few minutes someone stopped to greet her, and each interaction made David's old picture of her less reliable. He had remembered Vicky as someone who attended these rooms through him. Tonight, nobody seemed to need David's name to place her. Then his attention shifted to the small card beside the empty setting. A server adjusted the glassware, briefly turning the card toward David's table. He could not read the first name from 30 feet away, but the last name was clear. Roe. David's thoughts moved immediately toward business. The name was familiar beyond Vicky. Roe Meridian Group had been circulating through Mercer Development for months. His company was preparing a proposal for a major mixed-use redevelopment outside Boston, and Roe Meridian controlled the investment partnership capable of turning the project from an ambitious plan into the largest deal Mercer Development had ever handled. David had never met the company's chairman personally. Senior executives guarded access carefully, and negotiations had remained with an investment committee. He stared at the card again. Roe was not an unusual name, he told himself. There could be hundreds of them. Thousands. Connecting Vicky to that Roe simply because they shared a last name was absurd. Susan noticed the change in his face. What? Nothing. David reached for his water. You keep saying that tonight. Before he could respond, movement beyond the tall windows caught his attention. 3 black vehicles turned slowly into the circular drive beneath the venue lights. One stopped near the entrance while an attendant stepped forward. David watched without understanding why. At the same moment, Vicky's telephone illuminated beside her plate. She glanced down, read the message, and her entire expression softened. Not dramatically, just enough. She placed the telephone away and touched the empty chair beside her with the tips of her fingers. Then she looked toward the ballroom doors. David followed her gaze. Somewhere outside, a car door closed. Inside, the first toast was about to begin, and David suddenly had the uncomfortable sense that the answer he had been chasing all evening was no longer something he needed to search for. It was walking toward the room. The ballroom doors did not open immediately. That was what made David's attention to them feel increasingly foolish. The first toast began, glasses lifted, and laughter moved warmly through the room while Vicky remained seated beside the empty chair. Whatever message she had received seemed to have reassured her. She no longer checked the entrance. David tried to do the same. By the time dinner service began, he had almost convinced himself that the arriving vehicles belonged to another guest. Then Vicky rose to greet someone near the bride's table, and David found himself standing minutes later with Susan beside him, close enough that avoiding conversation would have looked deliberate. Vicky, he said. She turned. David. Her expression held the same calm courtesy as before. David gestured toward Susan. I do not think we had much time earlier. Susan and I are planning a spring wedding. May in Charleston, Susan said. Vicky smiled. That sounds beautiful. David waited for the question that normally followed. Venue, guest count, honeymoon, anything. Vicky simply lifted her water. How have you been? He asked. Good. Still designing? The question came out more casually than he intended. Vicky's eyes rested on him for a moment. Yes. Very much. I remember you used to talk about getting back to it. I did get back to it. There was no edge in her answer, only fact. David nodded. Mercer Development has grown quite a bit too. We are working on a major redevelopment outside Boston. If everything closes, it will be our largest project yet. Susan looked at him, and David immediately heard how unnecessary the information sounded. Vicky, however, showed no discomfort. That is a significant step. Congratulations. We are waiting on an investment partner. Which one? Roe Meridian. For the first time, something changed in Vicky's face. Not surprise. Recognition. It appeared only as a small pause before she took another sip of water. I know the company. David noticed. You do. A little. Before he could ask more, Susan spoke. And your husband? Is he joining you tonight? Vicky glanced toward the doors. The warmth that entered her expression was so quiet that David almost wished he had missed it. Yes. He was delayed in Manhattan. Business? Susan asked. Something like that. David looked toward the empty chair. What does he do? Vicky's eyes returned to him. He invests in things he believes can last. The answer was simple enough to reveal almost nothing. David smiled faintly. That sounds mysterious. He would probably say it sounds boring. Vicky smiled too. There was affection in it, easy and unguarded. Someone from Vicky's table called her name, and she excused herself. It was good seeing you both. Then she walked away again, leaving David with the uncomfortable feeling that he had spent 5 minutes displaying his life to someone who had never asked to see it. Susan waited until Vicky was beyond hearing distance. Why did you tell her about the Boston project? David frowned. She asked how I was doing. She asked how you were doing. You gave her a quarterly report. It was conversation. Susan studied him for a long moment. Around them, silverware touched china and the band began a quiet jazz standard. David, can I ask you something? Of course. She looked toward Vicky, then back at him. Did you bring me here because you wanted to come to this wedding with me? Or because you wanted her to see you with me? His expression tightened. That is ridiculous. Is it? You are my fiancée. I know exactly who I am. Susan's voice remained composed. I am asking who you needed me to be tonight. David opened his mouth, but no answer arrived quickly enough. Susan gave a small, disappointed nod. She did not create a scene. She simply stepped away to greet another couple near their table. David remained where he was, surrounded by people celebrating a marriage while suddenly uncertain what his own engagement had been asked to prove. Then the ballroom doors opened. Several guests near the entrance turned. Vicky did not look surprised. She only smiled, rose from her chair, and faced the man who had just walked into the room. The man at the ballroom entrance did not look like someone arriving to make an impression. Bennett Rowe paused beside the wedding coordinator, offered a quiet apology for being late, and handed his overcoat to an attendant before stepping into the room. His dark suit was understated, his expression calm, and for several seconds David searched for some reason the stranger seemed familiar. Then Thomas Bellamy crossed toward Bennett with a smile and an extended hand. Two executives near the bar turned almost simultaneously. The bride's father excused himself from a conversation to greet him. David felt the answer before he fully understood it. Bennett Rowe, founder and chairman of Roe Meridian Group. The same Bennett Rowe whose investment committee had been reviewing Mercer Development's Boston proposal for nearly 2 months. The same man David's senior partners had discussed in conference rooms, as if a single meeting with him could alter the company's future. David had seen photographs in financial publications, but Bennett looked different away from formal portraits. Less distant, more ordinary, more dangerous to David's assumptions precisely because he had no need to advertise his importance. Bennett greeted the bride's father, exchanged a few words with Thomas, then passed several people clearly waiting for his attention. He was not looking for them. He was looking across the ballroom. Vicky stood beside her chair. The moment Bennett saw her, his face changed. The professional reserve disappeared into something warmer. He walked directly toward her. Vicky did not rush to meet him. She simply waited, smiling in the quiet way David had already noticed whenever she looked at the empty chair. "Sorry I am late, sweetheart," Bennett said when he reached her. "Manhattan refused to cooperate. You made it." Vicky touched his arm. Bennett leaned close and kissed her gently on the temple before taking the seat beside hers. The gesture lasted barely a second, but David felt every assumption he had made that evening rearrange itself. Susan had returned to his side without him noticing. "That is Bennett Rowe," she said quietly. David kept his eyes forward. "I know." Susan looked from Bennett to Vicky, then back to David. "Rowe Meridian?" David nodded once. He could not explain why the room suddenly felt smaller. Vicky had not merely remarried. She had married the man whose company controlled the capital behind the largest opportunity Mercer Development had pursued in years. Yet Vicky had listened to David describe the Boston project without mentioning it. She had not smiled knowingly. She had not corrected him. She had simply said she knew the company. Dinner resumed, but David barely tasted anything. Later, as guests moved toward the dance floor, Thomas brought Bennett toward David's side of the room. Vicky walked with him. There was no avoiding the introduction now. Vicky stopped first. "Bennett, this is David Mercer, my former husband." "David, my husband, Bennett Rowe." Bennett extended his hand. His expression contained neither hostility nor amusement. "David, I have heard your name." David shook it. "Likewise." He wondered immediately what Bennett meant. Had Vicky spoken about him? Had Rowe Meridian discussed Mercer Development? Bennett offered no clue. Susan introduced herself, and Bennett congratulated them on their engagement with the same effortless courtesy Vicky had shown earlier. David attempted a smile. "Vicky mentioned you invest in things you believe can last." Bennett glanced at his wife, amused. "That sounds like something she would say when she is trying to make my work interesting." Vicky smiled. "I was being generous." Bennett laughed softly. David watched them and understood something money could not explain. There was no performance between them. Vicky did not become quieter when Bennett spoke. Bennett did not need the room to know he was important. When Vicky interrupted him to correct the name of an architect, he thanked her and continued. It was such a small exchange that nobody else appeared to notice. David did. He remembered all the years Vicky had adjusted herself around his ambition, and for one uncomfortable moment, he saw how different she looked beside a man who made no request for that adjustment. Then Bennett turned back to David. "Mercer Development," he said. "Your team submitted the Harbor Point proposal." David's pulse seemed to mark the silence. "Yes, we did." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "I have seen it. Nothing more. No promise. No threat." He simply placed a hand lightly at Vicky's back when someone called their names from across the room. "Excuse us." Vicky gave David and Susan a polite smile before walking away with her husband. David remained still beneath the chandelier light. He had spent the evening trying to determine what Vicky's new marriage meant for him. Watching her disappear into the crowd beside Bennett, he finally understood the more unsettling truth. Vicky had never once behaved as though it meant anything about him at all. David spent the rest of the reception waiting for something that never happened. Bennett never cornered him about the Harbor Point proposal. Vicky never used her husband's position to remind David, who now held more influence. No one whispered loudly enough for him to hear. No humiliation arrived. Instead, Vicky danced with Bennett beneath the warm ballroom lights, laughed with old friends, congratulated the newlyweds, and left shortly before midnight without looking back at David once. That absence of punishment followed him longer than punishment would have. 3 weeks later, Mercer Development received the decision on Harbor Point. David opened the message in his Boston office before sunrise, expecting Bennett's name to be hidden somewhere behind whatever verdict appeared. The proposal had advanced to final negotiations. Rowe Meridian's evaluation praised several parts of Mercer's plan and requested revisions to others. Nothing suggested favoritism. Nothing suggested revenge. David read the message twice before understanding what bothered him. Vicky could have interfered. She simply had not. Later that afternoon, Susan came to his office carrying the engagement ring in a small velvet box. She placed it gently on his desk. "I need time," she said. David looked at the box but did not touch it. "Because of Newport?" "Because Newport showed me something." She sat across from him, composed but sad. "I do not want to spend our marriage wondering whether I am your future or evidence that you survived your past." David had no defense that did not sound smaller when spoken aloud. Susan left without anger, and David remained beside the window as Boston moved 40 floors below him. For years he had measured success through expansion, contracts, square footage, and the approving attention of people whose names opened doors. Vicky had once helped him build that life. Then he had mistaken her willingness to make room for him as proof that she possessed no ambition requiring room of its own. Months later, David attended the opening of a community center outside Boston through a professional invitation. He almost declined when he saw Vicky's name on the program. Instead, he went. The building was filled with daylight, broad windows, reading rooms, classrooms, and a courtyard where children moved between tables covered with art supplies. Near the entrance, a modest plaque carried the name Vicky had chosen for her professional work, Vicky Winslow Community Initiative. Bennett stood several feet behind the gathered donors while Vicky spoke. He was not beside the podium. He did not introduce her. He did not need to. Vicky thanked the neighborhood organizations, the designers, the construction crews, and the families who had spent 2 years shaping the project. She spoke for less than 5 minutes. David remembered another Vicky at a dining table, architectural drawings pushed aside to make space for his presentation notes. He wondered how many times he had walked past the future she was trying to describe because he had been too occupied with his own. After the ceremony, Vicky noticed him near the courtyard doors. Surprise crossed her face, followed by the same quiet warmth she had shown in Newport. "David, I did not expect to see you. The project is impressive." "Thank you." He looked around the room. "You built something good here." Vicky glanced toward the families filling the space. "A lot of people did." David nodded. There were 100 things he could have said, including an apology large enough to contain several years. In the end, he chose the only sentence that felt honest. "I underestimated you." Vicky looked at him gently. "I know." There was no satisfaction in her voice. That was the final lesson. She had not been waiting for him to understand. Bennett approached from across the courtyard carrying Vicky's coat. She thanked him, slipped it on, and turned back to David. "Take care of yourself." "You too." Vicky walked away beside her husband as evening light stretched across the floor. David watched them leave, then looked again at the building around him. He finally understood that Vicky's victory had never been marrying a billionaire, and it had never depended on watching him fail. She had won much earlier in a small apartment at a second-hand table, when she stopped measuring her future by the man who had walked away. David once believed losing him would be the hardest chapter of Vicky's life. He never imagined it would become the chapter that taught her how to write the rest herself. If Vicky's journey reminded you that the strongest comeback is building a life you are proud of, please like and share this video with someone who needs that reminder today. Subscribe to Phoenix Soul Stories for more emotional stories about dignity, second chances, quiet strength, and the courage to move forward. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life, one unforgettable journey at a time.